So just to introduce myself, my name is Vic Howell, and I work for WECC, which is the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. I'm the Director of Reliability Risk Management there, and I don't want to get too deep into who WECC is and what we do, because I don't want that to detract too much from the conversation. But we are, for WECC, reliability is front and center. We are one of the 6 regional entities that falls under the NERC umbrella, and we carry out lots of the delegated functions we have associated with NERC. And in my role, I oversee our event analysis, situation awareness, and some of the reliability assessments that we do. But we're very heavily involved in resource adequacy is kind of front and center these days, so we have a lot of activity there. What I want to talk to you about today, I've been asked to talk about the contract path methodology versus the flow gate methodology or flow-based methodology. And first, I want to say that I am not at all a subject matter expert in this, but I know a little bit. And what I wanted to do today is just sort of talk about the concepts, because I know when you start talking about contract path and flow-based methodologies, what does it mean? What are we even talking about? So the idea today is just to get you a little bit of a foundation about what the concepts even mean, so that as you go forward and have subsequent conversations, it'll have a little bit more meaning to you. So there's a little bit of technical stuff here, but I'm hopeful that that we can work through that. So when you talk about the contract path method versus a flow-based method, it's all about determining how much power can be reliably transferred from here to there across the transmission system. There's a lot more to this, but at the end of the day, it's about how much power can we transfer reliably. So there's 2 general approaches. One is the contract path methodology, and the other is the flow-based methodology. What we generally see as the contract path approach is widely utilized in the Western interconnection, whereas the flow-based or flow gate method is more widely used in the Eastern interconnection. That said, there are entities who are in the West who are moving to a flow-based methodology. So let's talk a little bit about contract path. First of all, when we say the term contract path, what do we even mean? So this is from some FERC documentation. A contract path is a path that can be designated to form a single continuous electrical path between the parties to an agreement. So I've got an example to sort of help drive that home, to paint that picture for you. So in this example, we have one generator, G1, and one load here called L1, and we have these transmission lines that are all in between. So the contract path method essentially says, okay, I want to transfer power from here to there. So in order to do that, I'm going to move that power from here to here across a contract path. So what that does is it starts with a concept called total transfer capability. So total transfer capability is when engineers get together and they do some studies and they say, you know what, based on my assessments, it looks like we can reliably transfer a total of 1,000 megawatts across this path here. So once you establish the TTC, or the total transfer capability, then you say, okay, now that I've established that, now I want to actually move 100 megawatts from this generator 1 over to this load 1. So the way that's done is, according to the contract path method, we make that agreement, and it is assumed that 100% of that flow moves along this contracted path. And once you make that agreement and that agreement's in place, then the total transfer capability of this contracted path is reduced by 100 megawatts. So that is essentially at a high level the way the contract path method works. Now, if let's say that there is no available transfer capability along this path, so if they still want to move power, they can say, well, if this is a contract path, is there any room on this path for me to move those megawatts? Is there any ATC on this path? And the interesting thing about this contract path methodology is, and we're going to get into this here, is that it doesn't really have a basis in reality, if you will, or how power actually flows in the system. For example, let's say G1 wants to transfer 100 megawatts from here down here to the load. Well, if I've contracted that 100 megawatts to flow across this contract path, in reality, we've got some megawatts that flow along the purple path. We've got some megawatts that flow along the orange path. We've got some megawatts that flow along the green path, and so on and so forth. So in reality, the megawatts don't care about a contract. They don't care about a contract path. Electrons and power flows along the path of least resistance across the entire network here. And it's based on the physical properties of the power system. So everything that you see here, all these colors except for the red, is going to be considered loop flow or unscheduled flow. And you may have heard that term before. We have, I've heard it said that we have a real problem in the West with unscheduled flow. And, I may be totally wrong on this, but the thing that comes to my mind is it sounds like the only real problem with unscheduled flow is the expectation for flow to occur along a contracted path. So that's a contract path methodology. Here's another short, just a high level example involving two. So you've got two generators, G1 and G2, and this is a transmission network, and then you have two loads. Well, let's say that there is a ATC path or a path, contract path going from generator 1 to L2. And there is also a contract path going from G2 over to L1. And let's say in the example that G1 wants to move 5 megawatts over to L2 along this contract path. And G2 wants to move 4 megawatts from G2 to L1 along this contracted path. And you put that on paper and the agreements are made. However, in reality, the power actually flows according to the red figure here. So the power doesn't flow where it's quote unquote scheduled to flow. It flows where it goes from sources to sinks based on the physical properties of the system. So to summarize contract path, here are a few attributes of contract path. One is it starts with total transfer capability along that contracted path. And total transfer capability calculation practices vary. They vary pretty widely. Some TTC values can be somewhat static, some can be somewhat conservative, some of them are updated more frequently than others, but the practices vary. And one of the major components of the contract path methodology is that scheduling is based on that specific path that we discussed. But we also talked about the fact that it does not account for how power actually flows in the transmission system. So that's kind of a high-level picture of the contract path methodology. Now let's talk a little bit about the flow-based method and see, excuse me, how that looks a little different. Sorry, 1 second.
While Vic is clearing his throat there, if folks have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and I'll try to tee them up at the end. So take it away, Vic.
Okay, so under the flow-based method, the flow-based method determines impacts on predefined flow gates. And you've probably heard that term before. So what the heck is a flow gate? Very simply, a flow gate is a transmission element on the system. Could be a line, could be a transformer, and flow gates can also account for contingency elements. For example, you can say, what's the flow on this line if this other line trips, right? So that can exist as a flow gate. The flow-based methodology also uses a power flow model as its engine when it's doing its calculations that accounts for these things listed here. So you've probably seen presentations about with words, but I want to show you an example of what that actually looks like. So let's say we have a generator over here and we have a load down here. And we also, you see this thing, this border came up. Let's imagine, if you will, that all throughout here, there's a meshed network of a transmission grid. There's lines going all over everywhere between these 2 points. So under the flow-based method, a lot of really smart people come together and say, you know what, we've done all kinds of sensitivity analysis of power flows across this area, power flows from this generator over to this load. And what we've determined is that there are 3 facilities that really rise to the level of being a real concern. And these facilities can be those that are very sensitive to power transfers. And they can also be facilities that are, one, sensitive to power transfers, and also are kind of getting close to the limits when we run some of these assessments. So the determination is made, these are the different facilities that we really need to pay attention to from a reliability perspective. These are the flow gates, right? So once those flow gates are defined, the flow-based method asks the question, when I transfer 100 megawatts from G1 to L1, how does that transfer impact flow gate 1, flow gate 2, and flow gate 3? So that's the question that it's asking. And the way it answers that question is it uses what's called distribution factors. So I'll show you an example of what that looks like and how it works. But you see there's a fundamental difference between this and the contract path methodology. We're not choosing a path. We're looking at the source, we're looking at the sink, and we're looking at, well, what is impacted across the transmission system when you transfer power from that source to that sink. So let's say we've got our system here, and we also know that there are some transmission outages in a few lines throughout our meshed network. So what happens with the flow-based method is, the first thing is we understand what the planned outages are, and then we calculate distribution factors for the flow gates. And those distribution factors are calculated using a power flow model for the given topology of the system. You know, which lines are out, which ones are in. So when it calculates the distribution factor, here's what that means. The distribution factor answers this question. If I were to transfer 100 megawatts from here, G1, and send it here to L1, how much of that flow shows up on these flow gates? That's essentially a distribution factor. So the way it works is, let's say there's 100 megawatts of transfer. Based on the power flow model that underlies the machine, we've determined that the distribution factor for this configuration is 28%. So in other words, 28% of this generation, when you move power from here to here, is going to show up on this flow gate, right? And so then what happens is, you know, we know each flow gate's capability. Every facility has a facility rating. So this flow gate's capability then would be reduced by that amount, by the 28 megawatts. And then you just go through the rest of your flow gate. And our analysis says that, you know what, if we were to transfer this 100 megawatts, 16% of it, or 16 megawatts, is going to show up here. And 9 megawatts are going to show up here. So this is the idea that as you move power from here to here, where does that power show up? and so as far as the available transfer capability goes, the question that's being asked is, okay, if I move power from G1 to L1, are any of these flow gates maxed out that would prevent me from moving that power? So if any of these flow gates reach their capability that cannot accommodate that additional move of power, then the transfer capability from G1 to L1 would be 0. So that's the idea. So in a flow-based method, it starts with total flow gate capabilities. once you define those flow gates. And there's sensitivity methods and all kinds of methods that folks use to determine which flow gates I need to create. And then the process calculates the impact on those flow gates. So as we've talked about, scheduling is based on a source and sink approach, and it looks at impacts on those flow gates and doesn't look at a specific path. And the flow-based methodology also accounts for how power actually flows in the transmission system. So what I've described to you is pretty much what I know about the flow gate methodology and the differences between the two. And I'm hopeful that as you go forward, that helps sort of paint a picture of what that actually looks like.
Thank you. That was awesome. Katie, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Katie suggested this topic, so I'm going to ask Katie if she has anything to add, and then I've got a question in the chat, and then we've got time for a couple of questions or comments before I turn it over to Randy. Katie, anything you want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and thank you, Vic. That was a really great, easily digestible presentation for lots of audiences. So I just wanted to add sort of real world context at the end of this. And Vic did a really good job walking through what both of these methodologies look like on the side of the transmission scheduler, but on the side of like building these renewable energy projects, say a developer buys. So the way that it works currently in Washington, a developer would buy transmission for like 100 megawatts and would pay for it every hour of the year, even though it's only used 35% of the time, or whatever the capacity factor is. So a 100 megawatt flow gate could only ever support a 100 megawatt wind farm, even though that wind farm does not operate at max capacity. Whereas in an RTO, where they use security constrained economic dispatch, or SCED, which is just another way of saying what Vic is talking about here, this flow gate approach, instead of contract path, a developer would pay for the right to interconnect at a spot and then interject their energy there. And lots of studies are done to see how that impacts the grid. Upgrades may be built for reliability, deliverability, but the developer doesn't actually buy the transmission. So the power would flow based on economics and would obey the physics of the system in real time. And so then in an RTO, a 100 megawatt path could support, say, 300 wind plants, 500 megawatts of mixed wind and solar. And one other point that I wanted to make, just because of the way transmission is scheduled here in the Pacific Northwest and just getting ahead of potential issues we may think we have, I wanted to mention that RTOs do run SCED around legacy contracts, and that this is actually what the EIM is outside of California, for example. So there are things to explore. I know there are barriers, but I just wanted to put some real world context to it. And then I know there are questions in the chat, but my question from earlier, which I thought may be answerable by Vic or Commissioner Decker, is this need for a regional transmission study, perhaps by WECC or someone else. I am wondering what it would look like on a contract path basis versus a flow gate basis, and exactly what that efficiency gain would be, and if we or whoever else is considering that comparison and that methodology change for the study. Thanks for letting me add on a little bit, Rob.
No problem, Katie. Does anyone want to take a, do Vic, you or Megan, do you want to take a run at Katie's question?
I want to take a run at saying that it's a good question, and I don't, I think you should come to the CREPC YRAB meeting and ask it and have someone, there answer it. But I guess one thing I'll say about it is that, when we talk about incremental market development steps, we've got this energy imbalance market where there are various efforts afoot to develop day ahead markets, and I guess reforming our transmission system so that it's operating on something more like a flow basis than a contract path basis is another incremental thing that I've heard people talking about as a possibility. And so I think from my perspective, it seems like it would be a good thing to study to understand the benefits of.
You know, one of the unique attributes in the West is, well, let me back up. First of all, you know, WECC, we do collaborate with stakeholders, with transmission. We have a whole reliability assessments committee where we work with the industry to do, you know, long-term reliability assessments. But WECC doesn't plan the system. That's not our swim lane. That said, one of the interesting things about the Western interconnection is, as compared to the Eastern interconnection, is we have lots of small transmission planning groups. And this is not my area at WECC, but there's no larger centralized group, which presents a real challenge for transmission planning. And, you know, one of the things that WECC is doing is we're reaching out and we're trying to understand where the pain points are and how we might be able to assist in any way to sort of get over some of those hurdles. But, you know, if you compare the West to the Eastern interconnection, where you have large regional transmission organizations, RTOs, and they have a planning function within that broad footprint for the RTO, there's nothing like that in the West. You know, we have our FERC Order 1000 groups that were formed. You know, again, I'm speaking outside of my expertise, but it's just an interesting observation to see just how the unique situation the West is in there.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to have two more very quick questions in the chat, and then I'm going to come to Randy. And Randy, I'm going to keep your time whole, so I'm going to borrow some time from somewhere else. So on slide 6, Vic, that was a slide that showed the second example of the flow gate modeling. In slide 6, what does the transmission line in the middle look like in terms of ATC? Do the two contract paths of 4 megawatt and 5 megawatts cancel, or do they add?
They cancel.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then the second question is, I open it up, Vic, if you don't know the answer to this. I think there may be other folks on the phone that know the answer to this. Is how often is 100% of the contracted power actually used?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think it varies. It varies significantly. Mm-hmm. You know, there are some paths that fill up pretty quickly. You know, but others, I think you have quite a broad range.
Mm-hmm. Anyone on the phone have a sense? Yes, Stu.
Well, I don't have that statistic, but in terms of real life, we've heard from folks that we do certificates for, like a wind power supplier that has had to curtail, you know, shut down their plants because the contract power in the line was used up, but it wasn't all being used. There was actually capacity on that line, but by contract there wasn't, and so we lost that power. They lost that resource.
All right, thank you.
And apparently that happens a lot.
Okay, Vic, I have one final question for you, and then Randy, I'm going to come to you after this question. So Vic, the question is, in context of importing, exporting resources regionally, it seems like there's a lot of potential for efficiencies to be gained from flow-based modeling between transmission provider boundaries. How often does that happen within WECC?
How often does what happen? Help me understand the question.
Yeah, flow-based modeling out in between the boundaries of service providers, or you know, between IOUs or BPA.
I gotcha. Well, I don't think I don't know how many entities in the West are using the flow-based methodology. I think very few are. I do know that some entities in the Arizona footprint are transitioning to a flow-based methodology. So I'm not real sure, but I think some entities are beginning to explore it. And beginning to consider moving away from a contract path methodology. And, you know, I wonder if some folks are having a wait and see attitude to see how things go in the Arizona footprint and see what they can learn. I'm not sure.
Great. Thank you, Vic. Kathleen, any more on this one before we jump to the next one? Any final thoughts on this one, Kathleen?
Thank you very much. It was very thoughtful panel and a lot of big questions raised, so appreciate that. I guess my final question, Vic, is do you play all those guitars?
Yeah, I'm more than a collector, yes.